Hi, today I want to begin by giving you an introduction to Islam as a worldview. By beginning, I say I want to begin this unit or section on Islam. And if you recall, our definition of a worldview that we're working with is a shared grand story rooted in basic beliefs. They answer these core questions, that are part of a faith commitment. And that give shape and direction to our lives, both personally and collectively. And I want to look at Islam not just as a religion, but as a worldview. I want to use that definition as we look at Islam today. So we're going to begin, and I would like you to have with you a worksheet that you'll find on Brightspace. It's a worksheet called Introduction to Islam. It's keyed to October 8. And I'm going to be using that as a reference point. So this is a lecture for you, and you can use that for your notes to reflect on this teaching, kind of an introduction to Islam as a worldview. You can also be referring to this book, A Christian and a Muslim in Dialogue, one of the core books you needed for the course. And I'll make references to it, and on Tuesday you'll have a reading and an assignment connected with that reading. But I'm going to make reference to a number of the pages. Some of them you're going to read right away. Some will be sometime next week or so. But the first thing I want you to think about is how your experience has been influenced, your understanding, how your experience influences your understanding of Islam. I have a number of Muslim friends that have told me that September 11 changed their life. They live in the United States. One of them, an imam, had said to me that on September 11, he lost his religion and he lost his country. He's a loyal American. He is involved. He'd been in chaplaincy. He lived happily in this country. And when September 11 happened, he felt the pain of that attack himself. And then when people started marching on the mosque where he was working, and there were people surrounding it, and police were called, and there was a lot of danger. He said they were associating him with those terrorists, and he saw no connection whatsoever. For him, they were distorting what Islam stood for, and he lost his religion, meaning people thought that he was a terrorist because he was an imam. Well, September 11 impacted me too. And I started developing relationships with Muslims. There's large mosques in our community. I remember I had overcome some fear, and some of my family members would talk to me about that too, saying, is it safe to be interacting with these people? Maybe you've had interactions too with Muslims. Have they been good interactions? What were they like? Did you have overcome some barriers inside yourself? Like I did. I had to come and deal with some of my own fears in order to develop. Now some Muslims are my friends. And how is that for you? And I'd like you to take a moment and view a video. You'll find the link in the worksheet. You'll also see the link on Brightspace. It's called The Mosque Across the Street. It was developed by the big coffee company, Starbucks, and Starbucks has their own agenda for this. But I'd like you to pause this video and take a look at that one. The Mosque Across the Street. I think it's about 5 minutes long. I'll come back to you in just a minute. As you looked at that video, what struck you from the comments of the people who were making a bridge between the mosque and the church? Was there something that resonated with you? I know for me, one of the reasons I like to show this video is there's that tearful confession of the one man who had a fear and maybe even a hatred of Muslims, and now he was becoming friends with them. And he said, I realized that I was the problem, that what's afflicting the world was inside him. That was part of my own realization, and where I had to come to too, that what was affecting the world was inside me. Well, I'm going to begin about what is Islam. I've done some study. I have a Doctor of Ministry degree from Fuller Seminary, and I've done some study after that in Islam. One of my instructors is Dr. Martin Akkad. Martin is a Muslim. No, Martin is a Christian who's Arab. He lives in Lebanon. And he has a wonderful definition of Islam that I think is helpful. He defines Islam as a community following its holy book according to precedent. Now there's three things in that definition that I'm going to draw attention to: the community, the holy book, and the precedent. At its most foundational aspects, Islam is about a guide to life, and it imitates the prophetic precedent. You know, it imitates much of what Muhammad taught and did. And it's, in turn, that is to be a life aligned with the very will of God. This is the understanding of a Muslim. And they call that Sharia. Sharia is a word that literally means the path. Muhammad lived in the desert. Muhammad lived in the Arabian Peninsula. It's hot, dry. The path to the water hole was essential for life. And that's a Sharia. Sharia is the path. Christianity was originally called the way, which is a word for the road or the path. The way, a similar concept. And that is that it's a guide to life, imitating, for Muslims, the prophet or the prophetic precedent in light of the holy book, the Quran. So first think about it, the community. It's a community. Islam, Muslims call the community of followers of Islam the Ummah. And there's a chapter in the book that describes the Ummah. And Kadarenka and Schenck talk about the Ummah. And what's unique about it is that what they will say is it's not an ethnic group, it's not a tribe, even though it started that way. It's not a nationality, not a race, but really it's a community of Allah. It's a community of God, they say. All those who are devoted to following God, who are on that path of life, following the ways of God, that's the Ummah, the whole worldwide collection of those who are following the way of God. That's what makes a Muslim is what Muslims will call the 5 pillars. In this book we have, he describes them here and there, and you'll see them at certain places summarized rather quickly. But there are 5 pillars that account for the unity within Islam. Perhaps you've encountered or been, maybe you're from another country or lived in another country and you've encountered different Muslims. I've had some students from Indonesia, some from Nigeria, some from other places in the world where they've had direct impact with Muslims, some from Europe. And there's a wide variety, especially when I think of the Muslim friends I have here in the United States. I've also been to Egypt and been to Oman, which is on the Arabian Peninsula, and saw some of the differences in the way in which Islam, shows itself. One of my good friends is a Pakistani, and the way he lives his Islam, his faith, has some variance with many of the other friends I have, which are mostly Middle Eastern, from Palestine, from Lebanon, from Jordan. So it's a variety, and you also see that in terms of the ways that Islam is portrayed, in terms of your experiences, and you see them, some violent, many peaceful, some wearing long robes, some wearing the same kind of clothes you would wear. Well, what counts for the unity? Well, there's the 5 pillars. One thing that all Muslims hold in common are these practices that are essential to Islam. That's what makes a Muslim a Muslim. The first of the 5 pillars is called the Shahada. The Shahada is a profession of faith. Kadarenka and Schenck talk about that in pages 27 to 34, and you can look at that as I'm going to be looking at it now for just a moment. The Shahada is a confession of faith. You find it on page 27. And he has a transliteration of the Arabic. But it literally is, or in translation it is, there is no God but Allah. There's no God but God. But the name Allah, the word Allah, means God, but for a Muslim it means the only God, the one God. There's no God but Allah, the one God. And Muhammad is his prophet. In the book he translates it as he's the apostle of Allah. That confession, if it's uttered with sincerity, that's what makes a Muslim a Muslim. And they recite this confession every day as part of their regular prayers. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the heart of it. That's the Shahada. The second of the 5 pillars is Salah. And Salah is the 5 prayers that Muslims do every day. For a Muslim, prayer is the heart of religion. And I think there's some real validity there. You know that a person is believing in God because they're praying, right? And this is, you find in the Bible. The one who prays, believes that God exists, and he rewards or listens to those who call on him. I mean, you can't call on someone if you don't believe he exists. The heart of religion is prayer in Islam for Muslims. And they pray 5 times a day. And Schenck describes in pages 93 through 96 some of those prayers. What he describes is there's 5 daily prayers, and those prayers occur at set times in the day. There's a prayer that's between the dawn and the sunrise, when the dusk begins and yet before the sun comes up. Early in the morning, we pray. I was in Jerusalem, staying in East Jerusalem, and I remember how early in the morning there's just a glimmer of light in the horizon. I was staying in a hotel, had the patio door open, and I could hear the call to prayer loud and clear, resonating off the buildings. It was still dusky outside, early dawn, and they get up and they recite a prayer. Another prayer is between midday and mid-afternoon, kind of early afternoon prayers. And there's another prayer between mid-afternoon and sunset. And then a 4th prayer, the Maghrib prayer, which is just after sunset. I've been to events with Muslims where I was their guest, and it was a dinner, but the Maghrib prayer would fall in just at sunset. The dinner was in the evening, and as sunset came, some of them had their phone, would recite the call to prayer. They got up and they would pray. And then there's a prayer between nightfall and dawn. 5 different prayers throughout the day. It fills their day. That's the second of the pillars. It's kind of the heart of religion. And there are specific things they say in each of those prayers. And one of them is that confession, the Shahada. Well, a third part, or third pillar, is Zakah. And Zakah is, like for Christians, similar to tithing, although tithing means 10%. And Zakah is 2.5%. It's 2.5%, and not of your earnings, but of your increase in value. I've talked with an expert, a Muslim expert, on this issue. It's very complex to me. At least it has a level of complexity. And you would get help to figure out what zakat is. But zakat is not a tax. It's not really optional either. But that's 2.5% of your accumulated value, what you're worth. And it doesn't include things like what you need to live on, that accumulated value. It might say the value of your house or something, something that's a necessity. That's not part of the inclusion. But your accumulated worth. And it's only to be spent on helping the poor, to help the disabled, to help the oppressed, to help people who are in debt, and help others' welfare. And so it's a charity that's given out. It's required. It's part of the 5 pillars. And it's usually done at least once a year. 2.5% of your accumulated value, zakah. the fourth of the pillars, it might be something you're familiar with. On the sheet I call it Saum, which is the word for fasting, but you might call it Ramadan. Ramadan is the name of a particular month in the Muslim calendar. They have a lunar calendar, and so it's different than the calendar we follow here in the West, but their calendar, a particular month is called Ramadan. And that's when they fast. They fast for the entire month of Ramadan, about 28 days or so. It happens to be the 9th month of that Islamic calendar. And it will gradually move. A few years ago, it was in midsummer. Last year, I was at an event for Ramadan, or at least I connected with some of my friends about Ramadan, and it was, I think, late March, early April, something like that is when it began, and went for about 28 days. The idea is you fast from necessity. You fast from eating, you fast from drinking, you fast from smoking, you fast from sexual activity during the sunlight, during the daylight hours. In the evening, you can feast. An imam had once explained to me that Ramadan is really not just a month of fasting, but it's also a month of feasting. It's a month of hospitality. You invite friends over and you celebrate together. This year's been difficult for Muslims. It had been during Ramadan because of the pandemic. How can you celebrate with friends over, when we need to be socially distant? It was a little bit more complicated. But the idea of the fasting is to become aware of your own dependence on God, your dependence on Allah, and it fosters kind of a deep obedience. It's challenging. Some of my friends have talked about what happens. So one of them, who's a teacher, is talking about how at the end of the day, they're so weary. It even sometimes begins to affect their thinking because they haven't had any food and they haven't had anything to drink. And here they are at the end of the day, waiting for the sun to set. And then they can have a feast and they can have a celebration. There are exceptions in Ramadan, in fasting. If you're pregnant, if you're elderly, if you have a sickness, if you need to take medicines, all these things you can do. It's not strict in that sense that if you're pregnant, you've got to fast. No, you can eat. It's okay. That's part of the belief system. And then the fifth pillar, you might also be very familiar with. Sometimes it gets publicity. It's the Hajj. And the Hajj is a pilgrimage to the house of Allah. It's a building in Mecca called the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is a black stone structure that, according to Muslim teachings, is a place of worship that Muhammad cleansed from idolatry. And a lot of what happens in the Hajj is they reenact some of the events of the life of Abraham. Muslims will believe that Abraham went to Mecca. I think some will say that he built the Kaaba. I'm not 100% sure about that, but anyways, this is an obligatory once in a lifetime. Now, an imam friend of mine has gone numerous times, and he's done many Hajjs, M-I-N-I, but it's to be held in the 12th month of the Islamic calendar, and a particular event. It's a tremendously strong spiritual event, and it brings them in contact with the Ummah, because thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslims from all around the world are coming to Mecca at that exact same time, and they wear a white robe, so you don't know their class, their status. You might know their country of origin because they speak, but they're also going to speak in Arabic, the language of their faith. So you'll be able to get along, quite a few people, and it's an expression for them of the Ummah. So those are the 5 pillars. And I think that's what makes a Muslim a Muslim. Despite all the diversity. And as we talked about earlier, when I used the definition of a community resting on the Holy Book and built on the precedent of Muhammad, you see that the community is where we've been talking so far, but it follows its Holy Book. And that Holy Book is the Quran. And you'll see a little bit in Karanka and Shank on pages 59 to 61, a little bit about the Quran. The story of the Quran is that Muhammad, who was living in Mecca at the time, would go to a cave and regularly have meditation there. Muhammad was dismayed by the idolatry and the decadent lifestyle of the people of his day, and he went to this cave for solitude meditation. While he was there, Muslims will tell you, the prophet Gabriel, Jibril in Arabic, but the angel Gabriel came to Muhammad and commanded him to recite. And Muhammad said, I'm illiterate, I can't read. And gave the command again, got the same objection, and that the angel Gabriel gave him the capacity to recite these revelations. Now, what Muslims believe about the Quran is that it was set in heaven, and what Gabriel or Jibril is doing is he's transmitting the heavenly Quran to Muhammad. And Muhammad's just reciting what's recorded in the heavens. It is the Word of God, the heavenly and the divine Word. It was revealed over a period of years while he was living in Mecca as well as living in Medina. And it was formed into a collection after the life of Muhammad by the third caliphate. So that's the Quran. And we'll read a bit more about that when you get that far in about the Holy Book. And you're probably familiar with it. But they believe it's a revelation from God. And it's His Word. And the Quran is a different kind of book. It's kind of like the book of Proverbs in the Bible to some degree. The collections are scattered. They follow, and then they jump to another subject, and then they might follow that, and then to another subject. They're organized not according to the date of their revelation, but they're organized according to the length of the revelation. So the shortest one to the longest one. Muslims memorize large portions of the Quran and they recite it during their worship. Now then the next part, it's a community following its holy book according to precedent. Now what we see in this precedent is the life of Muhammad, and that the life of Muhammad is divided into two significant periods. And in those two particular periods, first in Mecca and then in Medina, there's a bit of a difference in terms of the emphasis or quality of those revelations. When you talk to a Muslim, especially an imam or someone who's going to explain to you the meaning of Islam, they will refer to a surah, which is a passage or a Bible verse, we would say, but they refer to a surah, a saying, out of the Quran, and then they will note this is a Meccan surah, or this is a Medinan surah. It came to Muhammad while he was living in Mecca or in Medina. And now that's significant in that the way Muhammad's life played out was that he began receiving his revelations, according to the tradition, in Mecca, which was a place filled with polytheism. They worshipped many gods, and it was a decadent place. And he had this revelation of there is but one God, not many gods. And he had much more of a role of a teacher, seeking to tell the people of Mecca about this revelation. And he gained a number of followers there. And then there's a certain period of his life where he was called, invited by the people of Medina to move there. And that's in 622 when he moved to Medina. And that's called the Hijra. And that event, the move from Mecca to Medina, is the 0 date on the Islamic calendar. That's where they begin their counting of dates from the Hijra, which is in 622. And when he was in Medina, he was more of a chieftain. the head of a tribe, the leader of this group. And that's where you're going to find more of the surahs, the chapters that speak a little bit more militantly. And there's considerable conversation in this book about the meaning of those teachings about war and so forth. Because there Muhammad was functioning like a military and political leader. And that's where he received considerable revelation about war. So you'll find that rooted in the revelation that they have within the community, a split between the Meccans and the Medinans. And it strike me, and my teacher Martin Akkad also draws this out, that what you emphasize, more the Meccan surahs or more the Medinan verses, shapes how you're going to live your understanding of Islam. So there's kind of this division that you see, and some of the radical Islamists, will refer to the Medinan surahs, and the folks who will say this is out of context, you need to understand the purpose, and so forth. Anyway, so that's a part of what's going on, how the life of Muhammad has shaped it. Now, you'll also see on the handout that's for you that Muhammad is the precedent. And that is that in addition to the Quran, what imams, what religious leaders will teach from is something called the hadith. And the hadith are the sayings, that's what hadith means, the sayings, and the actions rather, and the sayings, hadith is the sayings, and the actions are the sunnah and the hadith of Muhammad. That people around him, his wives, his followers, heard Muhammad say something. They wrote it down. Many years after the death of Muhammad, these sayings were collected and these actions of Muhammad were collected. And together, the sayings and the actions form what's called the hadith. And there's a whole science of the hadith that the scholars use to show how the life of Muhammad helps them understand the Quran. Because usually Muhammad is responding to a teaching or a revelation that was given to him from the Quran, as the tradition tells it. And then he says something or he does something in the light of that. And that becomes the hadith, it becomes part of the life practice of Muslims. So it's a community that follows Muhammad as its core, as its model. He's like an embodiment, my friends have said, he's the embodiment of the Quran. He's a walking, talking Quran. And so, according to his precedent, is how they live. A community rooted in the holy books, followed by precedent. Muhammad was born into a society in 570 that was corrupt, that was polytheistic. His father died before he was born. His mother died in early childhood. He was raised by his grandfather until his grandfather died, and then raised by his uncle Talib. And he at one point got married to a wealthy merchant woman, and that changed his life. And he was successful as a merchant, and it's when he was married that he began to receive these revelations as prophet. Those first revelations came during the month of Ramadan, and now Muslims will celebrate what they call the Night of Power, which is the first time that Muhammad received a revelation. And it's near the end of the month of Ramadan, and it's a very important time. They will want to certainly pray during that time, during that day, that Night of Power. And as I mentioned, the Hijrah is his movement from Mecca to Medina, and that's where he changed roles from more the prophet. They still called him the prophet, but he was also a political leader or a tribal leader. So I'm thinking about that and asking this question. So how might the life of Muhammad be a key part of the Muslim worldview? Remember, a worldview is that shared grand story that expresses basic beliefs rooted in a faith commitment that gives shape and direction to our lives. The life of Muhammad, in many ways, is the shared grand story, what I've told you about. And the revelations that he was given is that shared grand story, and it expresses some basic beliefs that are rooted in their faith, and it gives shape and direction to their life, both individually and corporately. Well, that's our introduction to Islam as a worldview. Thanks for hanging in there and following the worksheet. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thanks.